Welcome to Complex Creatures, exploring spirituality and the common good.
Hello, welcome to Complex Creatures, a podcast where we like to think about the world of spirituality, spiritual tools, practices, and all that jazz, not simply as a means for personal development or religion, but also as a means for promoting the common good, or at least promoting a better, virtuous, good life in public spaces. Today, we're going to be looking at a concept I'm calling the spirituality of the retrospective, or the enlargement of the daily examine. But we'll get to what that means in a moment. First, my name is Jarrod Longbonds. I'm the senior minister of Peachtree Christian Church in Midtown Atlanta. I have a PhD in theology, so yeah, I'm a practitioner of a certain form of spirituality. I'm a Christian. I try to be a Christian. And I also have done a lot of academic work in Christian theology and theology and religion from different perspectives. But I'm also just an astute observer of the way we engage each other in culture. So I like to study how we think about the important things. And like one of my favorite preachers wrote a book about Holy Envy, is the name of one of Barbara Brown Taylor's books. It's a book on, from a Christian perspective, kind of appreciating other religions. I do have some holy envy, so I like to look at other spiritual traditions, whether it's Buddhism or the Stoic tradition or certain areas of Sufi mysticism. I'm just a learner. And for me, I do believe all of it can be helpful. So that's a little bit about me in a nutshell. I'm going to hand it right now to our producer, my good friend, Alan. Alan, can you say a little bit about what you do? I think of you as a man with many skills.
Yeah, that's on purpose. Yeah, my name's Alan Barnes. I'm a professor of digital art at Johnson University in Knoxville, Tennessee. But I hold graduate degrees in music as well as visual communication art, specifically sequential art, which is the academic term for drawing comic books. So I do all kinds of crazy things related to media production, and I write books, and I write comic books, and I try to help people tell their stories.
It's awesome. I don't think we've really shared so much about ourselves, and that just might be me being a bit nervous. But ultimately, today, as we reflect, I might get a little bit more autobiographical. So I thought it'd be important just to kind of state where we're coming from a little bit. So let's think about the spirituality of the retrospective. That sounds like a mouthful, and it's clunky. And as far as I know, there's not a lot of literature about this, but you ever think about retrospective pieces? When I think of that, I think of journalism, where maybe a journalist is interviewing somebody as they look back over their life. Very recently, I was listening to a podcast from a theologian at Lipscomb. His name is Lee Camp, and the podcast is called No Small Endeavor. And he interviewed the great American ethicist and theologian Stanley Hauerwas. It was on Hauerwas's memoir, Hannah's Child, but I don't know, that was written over 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago. And Stanley Hauerwas is, I think, in his 80s. And in a lot of ways, the interview was a sort of a retrospective on his entire life and work. And I found it really spiritually engaging as he was being asked questions about his life, and him sometimes not knowing an answer of not knowing how to conclude some sort of point about his life, or not being so certain of what he'd learned, or maybe that he was morally just or something. And it was profound to see him look back, and I could see that working as a tool for the good. There are other retrospectives. Sometimes they're done musically and whatnot, but I think that it's an area that we may not think about very much in the concept of spirituality. On a personal note, I have to tell you that about a month ago, I was in Scotland playing golf. It sounds so cliche, and it sounds so cheesy, especially if you're in the clergy profession and you went on a golf pilgrimage, as it were. But I was able to go to the old course in St. Andrews, which I've grown up watching on TV as a child. I was able to play 6 other courses in the county of Fife, all around St. Andrews on the coast, and it was amazing. For those of you who know I love the UK. I did my PhD at the University of Nottingham, backpacked across Scotland after college, and in fact, the last time I was in Scotland was 20 years ago, this summer. And that was an incredible trip of backpacking from university to university town, looking at PhD programs, going with a professor and some friends from school, studying how Scottish folks viewed spirituality and religion, and just learning the culture a little bit. And I had a lot of thoughts while I was in Scotland about those 20 years and how my life had changed. I should say that, Alan, I had never set out to take maybe a bougie golf trip to Scotland. I started playing golf during the pandemic. And just as an aside, Alan, did you pick up anything new during the pandemic that you just put some new time in learning or new skills in, or did you just hone in and do something that you were already doing well and focus on it?
Yeah. So I did a couple of things. The first thing, it sounds preposterous when I say these things out loud, Jarrod. I got serious about the Irish banjo.
Okay. I love it. I didn't know Irish people had banjos.
Yeah. So the banjo that's most popular in America is a 5-string instrument, tuned to like an open G chord, and it's the thing that you're used to hearing on like the Beverly Hillbillies or something, The Irish banjo, though, is actually tuned exactly like a violin, down an octave, and it's played doubling all the violin parts. But the problem with it is that you don't have sustain, so you got to play a bunch of like extra notes in order to get around the sustain stuff. And so that's
like a mandolin where you pluck a string a lot.
Yeah.
Cool. That's really cool. I tell people that I didn't do well during the pandemic in a lot of ways. I languished. And I wish there was like those guys who got super fit. Or the two things I put myself focused into besides work and surviving and parenting was learning how to barbecue.
Nice.
I did learn a lot about barbecue. I'm not a master of it, but I'm good, I think, at least for my family's taste. And I started playing golf. Golf I played once a year, twice a year.
Sure.
I really like it. I just always kind of fancy myself as man without the time or the money. But playing at this little municipal course by my house is really, really affordable. And I started going out because that was the thing I could do outside, away from people. So I was relatively safe from germs and the virus. And then when I started playing a little bit more regularly towards the end of the pandemic and we were coming out, I found out that, I do enjoy the physical activity of it, and that hitting this little white ball is so challenging that I didn't worry about anything else. So it was a mindful exercise that actually brought down my high levels of anxiety. And at that time I was suffering from a great deal of anxiety. So golf became very therapeutic for me. And now I do consider it a spiritual tool or discipline. My goal every time I golf is never to get angry or to keep the anger or frustration in check, because it's a frustrating game.
Sure.
And so it's all about self-mastery for me. But my story is that coming out of the pandemic and coming back to regular life, there was something going on in my body and I had no real clue about it. But two Labor Days ago, I discovered something kind of going a bit strange in my body. I amassed 30 pounds of water weight in a week. And I avoided the doctor, and had been avoiding the doctor for about 5 years. And all of a sudden, I was in the office one day in oversized clothes, and I told a staff member that I work with about it. And they said, "You need to call the doctor." Well, I don't want to tell this full story. I'll tell it another time. But I called I called a friend who called the doctor. The doctor called me and said, "Get to my office immediately." And by the time I'd driven there, I turned Simpsons colored yellow, and my eyes looked like lightning bugs, as we say in the South and the Midwest. And I was in liver failure, and I almost died. And within 2 weeks, there was two times I was very, very close to death. I was able to sort of stabilize and start working on getting to a certain level of health. But I had to go on about 6 months of medical leave from work, where I was basically going to the doctor's office, managing my medication, focusing on diet, and eventually I started exercising by just walking. For a long time I could hardly walk even to the mailbox and back. So it took a long time for me to be able to start walking around my neighborhood, and then it took months before I could go swim at the YMCA. But I was just trying to get control and stability of my body. About 6 months in, I was able to go back to work, but I still had liver disease, and it was really bad. So I was just managing life. And at some point, the doctor said, "Look, you've come as far as we think you can come." In fact, they said it was heroically far. We think you need to do everything you can to get on a transplant list. And if you don't need it, you don't need it. But if you do, liver disease can turn south real quickly. Then you'll be ready. And it takes a lot to get on. So I spent last summer doing everything to get on the list. And then in the fall, in October, I got on the list and I got a liver. And as I was laying in my den at my house on a twin bed on the floor, recovering, my uncle texts me and says, "Hey man, life's short. You survived. Do you want to go to Scotland this summer?" And I looked at my wife and she says, "We could probably make that happen." And so I said yes before she could say no. And next thing you know, we were planning a pilgrimage to play golf at these historic places in Scotland.
Nice.
I didn't even put together that it was going to be 20 years since I had been last to Scotland. And I always tell people Scotland is the most beautiful place I have ever been, especially in the Highlands. And I was so looking forward to going and not knowing what to expect besides links golf. But while I was there, Alan, I started having interesting just thoughts, walking the cobblestone streets of an ancient city that has this world-class university and a ruined castle and a ruined cathedral where supposedly St. Andrew's bones were brought from the Holy Land, from St. Rule, and why it's called St. Andrew's, and just kind of imbibing the place. And when I would get alone away from my golfing comrades, I would think about the last time I was in Scotland, last time 20 years before, and I thought about my life. And that led me into an interesting sort of retrospective of who I was 20 years before to who I am now. A lot's changed. I'm married. I have 3 kids. I mean, at that time, I was still studying with dreams of getting a PhD in theology. I've since done that. But I look back at who I was 20 years ago, thinking about the fears that I had, the anxieties I had, and maybe even some of the delusions of grandeur. You know, I thought I might be the kind of man who maybe had some notoriety or had some importance in some sphere of my life. And as I stand on this side of history, I don't know that I've ever become the person the younger me dreamed of or whatever, but I also like who I am now much more than I liked who I was then. I've grown in that way, right? So looking over a span of 20 years itself can be an interesting exercise. Have you ever deigned to do that, Alan, just to take a look back over a period of life?
You know, interestingly, I just did exactly the same thing a few days ago. But 20 years ago for me, I made a decision to change my life, not because of any health reasons or anything. It was, I got to the end of my 20s and thought that by then I was going to be a prolific musician. And what ended up happening was I turned 30 and realized that I hadn't achieved any of the goals that I had set out to achieve. And I was very, very frustrated with my life and was very frustrated with my relationships at the time. And so I was living in Atlanta then, and I literally like packed up and moved to Nashville. I went back to school. I finished my undergrad, which I had not up to that point, and 2 master's degrees. Met my now wife. I mean, really everything changed and started moving in a good direction for me once I made a decision to be thoughtful and forward thinking about the direction of my life as opposed to allowing things to happen to me. And I was actually just thinking the other day about how different my life is now as a result of that decision.
What was the experience of looking back on it for you?
The experience of looking back on it for me was to think about all the, I was revisiting several of the decisions that I made along the way and evaluating if they were good or not. And that was probably unhealthy in some ways because I was thinking mistakes I've made over the last 20 years. But it also sort of was an experience of me trying to figure out what the future is now. It was one of those deals where 20 years ago I made a decision that I think impacted my life positively. But I think for the last several years I've been getting back into old habits of allowing things to happen to me, and so I want to really pinpoint trying to figure out what direction I'm going in, and looking back on decisions that I've made to figure out what things worked and why was a big part of what I was trying to think through now.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think that taking a look back is always it always has the possibility for something good. Probably the shallowest level is nostalgia, although nostalgia can be deep. But what I noticed, what I was just doing almost intuitively was having these moments of looking back and also it was just happening. I was seeing who I was, seeing who I am now, taking an honest look. But I was having these moments of what I believe in my theology is seeing God along the way, where sometimes I may not even have noticed God in the midst. Now, for those of you who are secular or not typically religious, maybe for you would say that it's the universe or it's for just the fortunate or what have you. But maybe you can look back on your life and you can see a sense that you are not wholly responsible for what's happened in your life, and that even things that have come along your way have been blessing, or sometimes maybe blessing in disguise. But sometimes we get the things that we are looking for, and it's a blessing. The blessing comes because we got something completely different, and sometimes the blessing comes through trial and struggle. But I was able to see where I felt the divine moving in my life. And that was not in a sense, and I think in a real way, giving me a spiritual experience in that moment. I was looking back, and when you look back, you gain this perspective that says the worries and fears and struggles you had back then you don't evaluate them the same way now. And so if you take that enough and far enough, it can expand your sense of confidence. At least it was doing that for me. It was expanding my sense of confidence and my sense that I'm not really alone in this journey. For me, God is close, always so close. But also I felt, especially in this ancient place, surrounded by a communion of saints, as they say, a community of other pilgrims. I think for a lot of folks on this trip, it might have been just the going to this historic place of golf, and you look and you see a lot of other Americans doing the same thing, and that's great too. And there was something in some sense mystical about golfing in those places where it's the birthplace or the homeland of golf. There is something to it, and I'm not going to take away from that. But my experience was fuller because it was putting my life in a retrospective where I could see some bookending in a way that let me know that God was present even in the journey and in the places of that journey where I didn't think God was. The first time I went to Scotland, back then, I enjoyed beer. I'd smoke a pipe. I fancied myself sort of a British academic. I sat on the banks of Loch Ness, waxing poetic about the mythical looking space. I learned about Scotch, and I tasted scotches and Scotch, whiskey in the places where they're made, and I learned why it was beautiful. Good. I became a big lover of Scotch, or just as they call it, whiskey over there, right? Now I can't drink alcohol. It'll kill me, and it was a part of my undoing in a lot of ways. My doctor says not everybody's body can process it the way everyone else can, and it really was part of of a recipe that really was causing my liver health, including genetic fatty liver disease, high levels of stress, not going and having regular physicals, and all that jazz. So I look back on that. I look back at my anxiety levels as a younger man and kind of my aspirations, and I'm just in a different place, and it's not a bad one. So I could be grateful for it. It's a good place, but I noticed along the way, and I'm not going to go into all the stories and all the moments of 20 years where I thought, oh, God really was there. But what it did was looking back at the roadmap and seeing it for what it was, doing that bit of life. You can only, as they say, live it forward, but it can only be interpreted backwards. Doing that interpretation was itself a spiritual experience. So having the knowledge that God was already there made me feel the presence of the divine in that moment that I was experiencing it. Does that make any sense, Alan, or is that a little esoteric?
No. That's amazing, and an experience that I hope everyone has at some point.
Me too. I came home and I don't know, I tried to process the experience itself, and I seek spiritual direction. That's something we'll talk about along the way here, the tool of spiritual direction or holy listening, but having a companion listen to help you discern how the divine might be speaking in your life. And it's not therapy, it's not counseling, it's not simple instruction or discipleship or training or teaching. It touches areas of all those things, but it's this companion that can listen and hear and help you focus your attention to maybe how God is already moving or the divine is already moving. And I said, is this a spiritual tool you know of? And he said to me, he goes, well, it certainly sounds a lot like the Examine. What is the Examine or the daily Examine? If I were to give you some words, I would say the daily Examine is a practice that it comes out of the Ignatian spirituality tradition. So I'll talk about what that means in a moment. But if I were to give it some words to say what happens in the daily Examine, it's a practice of recalling, reflecting, reviewing, repenting, and resolving. And those are just some R words I could put to it. That's recalling the day, reflecting on it, not just recalling in terms of point A to point B to point C, but to reflect on the events of your day, then review it kind of in a moral sort of way or a spiritual sort of way. And then you repent, the things that you need to move into a new direction from based on your day, the things you need to seek forgiveness about or you need to fix. And then resolve. There were some resolutions for your tomorrow day. It's a very, very healthy spiritual tool for a daily sort of reflective practice. And I think it can be helpful because a lot of times we replay our day when we're trying to sleep and we're lay down in bed, and sometimes the things that can nag you. This is a way to even address that. This is a way to kind of put things in a manageable review that can help you go forward in a way that's healthier, because you can't change the past. All you can do is think about going in the future. So examination practices are ubiquitous in spirituality. I mean, if you're in this 12 steps, we talk about making a moral inventory. If you're looking at the Hebrew Bible and Hebrew religious traditions, there is an entire calendar of feasting and fasting, where at feasts and fasts you're telling your stories, you're rehearsing how God has moved in your life. You rehearse maybe the things that went wrong and why the people were punished or are allowed to go into exile. So it's like a review. It's like a big review, but in a way, it's even bigger than what I'm talking about, because it's about the review of the people of God. Stoic reflections. You can read any Stoic writer, but Marcus Aurelius would talk a lot in the book Meditations about kind of putting your life into a cosmic review, like the smallness and the brief quickness of your life compared to the stars. Buddhist the reflections on repulsiveness practice, where you're actually trying to overcome sensuous pleasure by certain mindful techniques. All of these things, and there's so many more, are practices of examination and reflection. What we're drawing on today is the concept of the daily Examine from Ignatian spirituality. Now, have you ever heard of the name Ignatius or Ignatius of Loyola, Alan?
I have, and partially because a very famous old comic book character is named after Ignatius, Ignatz, the mouse.
Who's that?
Uh, so there's a one of the greatest comic strips of all time is something called Crazy Cat by a guy named George Harriman, famously one of the few black comic book or pardon me weekly comic creators of the 1920s. And
Yeah,
Ignatz the Mouse uh, is all about.
that's awesome. Well, Ignatius is often known in America because Loyola University, Loyola Marymount, all these Loyola or Ignatian named schools. Ignatius of Loyola was a Spaniard who founded the Jesuit order, the Society of Jesus, and part and parcel of their philosophy or their mission is education. So my brother went to Loyola and University in Chicago, for instance. So you hear those names, Ignatius and Loyola, tied to educational institutions. Ignatius lived from 1491 to 1541. There's a great story about how, I mean, in that day, like he was wounded. He had a severe leg injury, wounded in battle, and he lived in a period of history where there was a lot of glory in war, and he was sidelined and not very religious, but he was sidelined and he felt shame, and he wanted to go and have this glorious life in battle. And so he was sidelined for so long, he couldn't move for health reasons. He asked for, some books to read. He really wanted to read some of the romantic epics and the romantic battles. He wanted to read about King Arthur and these chivalric knights who were, in glory and for honor and chivalry going to battle. And I believe there was none of those books on hand, and so he was given some hagiography, some lives of the saints, and he started reading about the lives of the saints, and because of all of that, it radically changed his life. He had a moment, he had an experience of reading about not just glory, but glory born out of divinity, and it set him on a new path, all because he was sidelined from doing what his calling was, what he thought his calling was. I actually feel resonance with that, as I was sidelined with my liver disease for a long time and you're unable to do what you think you're supposed to do. And in that, discovering there might be something else. In your weakness can come your strength. He developed this incredible body of literature that is just practiced and written about and talked about, called the Ignatius Spiritual Exercises. And you can get that text, you can get translations of the text, you can get famous theologians and writers who have reflected upon the text, like Karl Rahner. You can go to ignatiusspirituality.com and you can get updated language of this text. And in there, he has, again, this daily examen. So let me just kind of break out what that daily examen is. And some of this language comes from that website, ignatiusspirituality.com. Some comes from other sources. But the first step is this. Become aware of God's presence. It's like clearing your mind, setting, if you ever saw that movie, For the Love of the Game, Kevin Costner is pitching, he always says, clear the mechanism. Being able to sit somewhere and try to clear your mind, get your mind right in the headspace, be aware of God's presence. And I would say for Ignatian spirituality and for a great deal of Christian spirituality, this isn't like mental traveling to some spiritual distant point where God is far away. It's God is already close to you, closer than you are to your own self. So first, take a beat, take a few beats, become aware of God's presence. Second, begin to review the day with gratitude. Now, this could be a movement of thinking of your blessings or your fortunes. Several episodes that we recorded ago, we talked about Japanese Nikon and writing down all the things that you have not done but have been given to you. I mean, you can do it any number of ways. There is no shortage of books that you can find on Amazon, a lot of them produced from Silicon Valley thinkers and leaders that are just secular blessing and gratitude journals, because the practice of gratitude is effective and helpful for your mind and all that. And it's all true. But this is rooting it in something spiritual, reviewing your day with gratitude. Step 3, pay attention to your emotions. Maybe that's a that's kind of a contemporary version. Pay attention to your emotions. Like, how'd you feel about that today? When you had that interaction with so-and-so, did it make you feel funny? Did it make you feel happy? Did you get angry? You might just simply ask the simple question, how'd you live today? As you go through your day, are you proud of your choices? Do you wish you could take that one back or get that one back and get a do-over? Or in the world of golf, do you need a breakfast ball? Do you need a gimme? But it's being honest. It's evaluating. It's taking a look. The next step 4, is forgiveness. In a large part, you should seek forgiveness for what you've done wrong. That's Ignatian spirituality. It's deeply Christian in that way. If I were to update this, I would say maybe, let me update it in a moment. Let me come back to forgiveness in a moment. But and this is now a movement of prayer where you're actually praying about the events of your day, seeking forgiveness. So you're now praying about it. You're not just thinking about it. You're in a sense trusting by putting it into the hands of God and taking burden away from yourself. And then finally you look forward, or you make resolution or a commitment about tomorrow. And so it's important to remember, for every one of us in human development, you can't control something that has been done. All you can do is think about the future. It's a very healthy thought in a relationship. Like, I always know I'm in the wrong when I'm in an argument with my spouse and she says, honey, I'm done, because the only way to make it better is if I could go back in time and not said or done that thing. That means what I'm doing is I'm beating a dead horse. Like, it can't be changed. So really my focus ought to just move to the future. And then I can make my requests like, well, in the future, could you not say that? Or in the future, when this happens, could we do this instead? And all you can do is think about the future, right? I mean, that's just a healthy strategy, but it's also really healthy spiritually for yourself. You cannot dwell on Tuesday when it's Friday. You can only ask what you're going to do on Saturday and what you'll do the next thing you have. So this daily examine, it sounds simple, but to do that work is heavy spiritual lifting. It's intentional. It's thoughtful. It calls you back to the scene of perhaps your crimes, perhaps your glories. But it's a systematic way of going through your day, and it's kind of bathed in grace, because God's presence is noted. There's gratitude. There's confession of wrong. There's even an intention going forward. So anyway, that's the daily examine. I think it's a fantastic tool. It's one that I try to do, but probably don't do quite enough. And when I brought the practice from what was happening to me in Scotland to my spiritual director, he said, well, there is the daily examine. Like, this is a spiritual tool that has been practiced for hundreds and hundreds of years. That's true. But what we started thinking, what I've been thinking on ever since, is maybe that tool, if it's expanded, is still a healthy spiritual tool. And that's why I'm talking about the spiritual retrospective, or the enlargement of the examine to include sections of your life, larger swaths of time than just a day. Is there benefit in that? And from my first person anecdotal experience, I think so. In your case, Alan, I think you were able to sit back and be appreciative in some way for the choices you've made, right? I mean, that's it.
Yeah, in a lot of ways. I mean, I obviously was able to pinpoint a handful of things that I did poorly, and well, I don't think that's your question, but yes, for the most part, I was able to be appreciative, but I also saw things that I did poorly, and I think being able to move forward with that is awesome.
Yeah. Well, don't let me forget to come back to the things that you said you saw over those years poorly. And I want to tie that into the language of forgiveness that I mentioned a moment ago with the daily examine.
Okay, great.
I've been really compelled, and I've talked about and even written about this. I've just been really obsessed with the documentary by Andrew McCarthy called Brat. I think it's called Brat. But it's about the Brat Pack, right? And one of the things I noticed about the Brat, so so like I said, we've talked about this. I grew up watching movies with the Brat Pack people in it, and it's been, I don't know how many years on, but it's an anniversary year. And so Andrew McCarthy, one of the actors associated with the Brat Pack films, wrote a piece in the New York Times that tipped me off to, and he was kind of assessing his feelings about being in the quote unquote Brat Pack. And he made this documentary. I believe it's on Hulu. It's streaming. And he talks to a lot of the other actors that were in these films. And it's a most immediately jarring thing from just a moviegoer myself is that, like, they're not all in contact with each other as friends. I mean, you think if you're a pack of people that you're going to be friends. And that's part of the point. There is no such thing as a brat or a rat pack, right? They unlike the Rat Pack, the Brat Pack, these were just a bunch of 20-somethings in movies, and most of them didn't feel like they were in a club or in a group of friendships. That was just kind of an external kind of assumption. But then, more importantly, is that all of them that he spoke to, including himself, felt pretty irritated and hurt from the label Brat Pack. The reason why is a brat is not a positive thing. I know it's a play on the word rat from the Rat Pack of the 60s and all that, but it implies that, like, a lot was just handed to these guys. And this whole sea change was happening in Hollywood. All the leading figures before the Brat Pack were more mature adults, and now they're young 20-somethings, and movies started being made for these young 20-somethings and teens and kids. And it really changed media for the marketing and making content for the youth demographic.
Sure.
They felt burdened by all of it because, they felt like they really worked hard for these roles, and they trained and they went to school for it. It's their profession. And so they talk about it. Some of the actors didn't want to talk, but Andrew McCarthy, in his article in the New York Times and talking to some of his former co-stars, it really burdened me. It hurt me. I think it pigeonholed me. I think it affected my career. But now I look back on it differently. And I look back on it and I think to myself, kind of proud to be associated with that and those people in that time. Now, certainly, this is the retrospective that's happening here. Age and maturity can bring some of that to the fore. But when I watched it, I asked myself another question. I asked, what of now that I consider to be a pain in the neck, and who of now in my life that I consider to be an annoyance will I look back on later and smile fondly about, or think this was a good time?
Sure.
And in that way, I connected, and I've talked about this, I've connected that to the concept of memento mori, remember your death. Like, but if you are always thinking, if you're regularly thinking about the fact that you'll die, you perhaps will live more rightly or more purposefully now. But if I fast forward in my thinking to the future about how I will appraise my time now, maybe I can live those experiences and feelings now. So maybe I can actually live more purposefully, more graciously, more appreciatively now, even in this thing that I consider to be challenging or a struggle or whatnot. I don't know. And maybe that's just a thought. Maybe it's just a psychological idea. But it's wedded together with this experience I just had in Scotland, where I look back over a chunk of time and I see how perception, experience, and life has changed against what I expected and even dreamed and hoped for. And I'm quite blown away by it. And then, as a person of spirituality, I look back and I also think I identified God in those places. And it gives me this experience of gratitude for a groundedness that is above myself. I say that in a very weird way, a groundedness that is above myself. Our foundations are things that we stand on, we build structures on, but rather like a suspension bridge, our true foundation in a spiritual sense or a religious sense is above us. The foundation is not something you can see when you're standing on a bridge. When you're driving in a car across a suspension bridge, you can't see the true foundation. It's above you. I mean, that a metaphor may break down. I'm not an architect or an engineer, but it comes from above. It comes from beyond, and I get that sense from looking back. So when I broaden the lens, like I was in Scotland, I look back. I said, where was God? And I think about, where was God when I was hiking up that mountain at Loch Ness with with Scott Nelson, this guy I was in school with, and I ate heights, and we walked up it, and then he said, he challenged me to start climbing with him, and we just started climbing, and he started hollering at me to climb with him, and I overcame this big fear. And as I got to the top, I could look to behind me, and there was rolling green hills and cliff faces for as far as the eye can see. I could look down, and I was like the little hostel we stayed in looked like a speck on a beach of rock, and there's the Loch Ness. I could look across rolling greens as far as I could see, the misty har, sort of, if it is har on a lake, I don't know, that's an ocean term. It's coming down the way, and I feel like I'm in this mythical space, and I would have never seen this, and there was not a soul in sight. I would never have seen this place had I not gotten over myself and from the encouragement of another person gone up, right? And I felt these chills, these close to God feelings being in that wild landscape. I mean, where was God 20 years ago? And what was God saying to me then? I feel this sense of confidence in that moment. And perhaps maybe God has been there trying to give me confidence throughout my tenure. And it's one of those things where I just kind of keep holding onto the security blanket of fear. Sure. I've done that so much. And here I am standing on the other side of it 20 years later, and I've gone through this health travail and got a new liver. Am I flirting with going back to all the fears all the time and all the anxieties? Am I flirting with that? Where was God in the past? Well, God did keep showing up and being there. I don't know. Maybe I'm just being nostalgic and looking back with rose-colored glasses. But I can look back over these 20 years with gratitude for all the fortunate things that have happened in my life. And a lot of those fortunate things are me not getting what I wanted. I can look back in following the exam, and I can look back at how I felt, and then I can compare it to how I feel. And seeing those two differences shows the dynamism of life and perhaps what God is doing. And then here's the next one, bud. On step 4 of the exam is this forgiveness thing where you ask forgiveness for what you've done. And I sort of feel like when we broaden the exam as a retrospective, you look back over a section of life like 20 years like we were looking, and maybe the forgiveness thing applies also to not just seeking forgiveness from God, but maybe offering yourself some forgiveness. Maybe it means also that maybe there's a part of this too where we go, at least in terms of classical Christian spirituality, I'm already forgiven by God. Maybe it's time we look back and also have the boldness to forgive ourselves. Right? At least I was trying to do that. And then we resolve. We think about where are we going now. It really transformed that entire trip for me to think this way, such that on the plane back, I was by myself. I left on a different plane than the people I traveled with. And I watched 3 or 4 movies, and in all the movies I cried, because it made me tender spiritually. This entire experience, I was very close to emotion. I was very close to understanding how I felt. Like it was all, I didn't have to search for it. And so every movie did its thing, its narrative, dramatic thing where, it touched me in some way, even if it were kind of a shallower movie. But I watched this movie that I've seen before called The Way, and Emilio Estevez did it, and he had his father, Martin Sheen, star in it, and it's, I think, a passion project for them both. Martin Sheen is a very devout Roman Catholic, and The Way is about a father who's rather nominally Catholic. His son decides to quit his PhD program and travel, and he wants to get out and live life. And so he goes to do the Camino de Santiago, the great pilgrimage that goes through Spain and France. And on the day 1 of his pilgrimage, he has an accident and dies, and Martin Sheen's character's father has to go over and get his body, and then he ends up taking the pilgrimage for his son. And there's a lot of cutting back between him being there and moments with his son. And they're in an argument at one point, and he says something about, like, I know you don't like how I choose to live my life. And his son says, you don't choose, or you don't choose life or choose to live a life. You just live it. And there was this moment about like receiving the life that you have and then choosing to live it rather than making it all about all the plans and all the ways that we can structure it. Oh man, I cried like a baby on the plane. I cried like a baby because I realized that in that movie, the movie's about a pilgrimage, and it's a pilgrimage that the dad didn't intend to go on. The son did, and he didn't make it, but the dad went, and he unwittingly became a pilgrim. And I realized that so much of my life has been an unwitting pilgrimage.
Sure.
And that's the end result of my 20-year look, is that I was on a pilgrimage I didn't know I was on for a while. Most pilgrimages we choose. We book it, we plan it, we take the steps. But in this case, I learned that I was already on it and had to catch up to that thought and reality. The time-worn tradition of the examine is really, really helpful. But I think there might be some benefit for all of us in expanding it out and looking at chunks of time. I don't really even have it all worked out on like when it's advisable to do that.
Sure.
It just so happens that I went to Scotland 20 years later. Would it have made a difference if it was 19 years later or 21? I don't think so. 20 is a nice round number for us, right? But it could be the beginning and the end of a season of your life. We talk in that way about seasons. I don't know, but I think taking time to take stock and do a retrospective can be helpful, not just in experiencing God through history, but also in transforming the way we think about tomorrow. I think it would be a mistake, Alan, to wait till the very end of your life and do it once. I was chatting a lot there. I was just going, but do you have any observations or thoughts or questions? Or
I had a lot of thoughts in process, and they'll seem sort of random if I back up and sort of insert. But the first one that I had was when you were talking about golf. It made me wonder if you've ever read The Inner Game of Golf or The Inner Game of Tennis or any of those kinds of things, because they're all about something similar to what I think you're. I don't know that this is directly relevant to what you're describing, but it's all about getting out of your own way and allowing you to get through the task at hand, you know. And I think that that's more of a now issue than a retrospective issue. I also think that it's the idea of being fully present, and I think that and that's part of what you're trying to. I think that's part of what you're discussing right now, is this idea of being fully present now, because you're able to evaluate things from your past or from the day in order to focus and move forward, you know.
I like that. So no, I've not read those books, but let me say I have read Golf in the Kingdom, which I don't have the author in front of me right now, but Golf in the Kingdom is a very famous, some people call it philosophy. It's a work of spirituality, and I think it's very, very heavily based on Hindu spirituality. And it follows an American golfer who's on his way to India, and he stops in Scotland to golf, and he meets sort of a guru type golfer.
Right.
And a lot of those lessons of the present, of the moment of being now, is in golf. There's a lot of that's elicited in golf. Like the legend of Bagger Vance, I understand, is a metaphor for Hinduism. And I'm told the book is far better than the film. But even when I've read a few sports psychologists talk about golf, and it really is about being in the present, it's just why I actually prefer walking if I can walk as opposed to riding a cart. It's a rhythm, it's a pace thing. But being present is so important for all things spirituality. But I think it's important for performance as well. And so there's just this, when I speak publicly, I'm best when I'm in the flow.
Sure.
And it makes sense, right? I mean, whatever that flow state is.
Right.
And so I work very hard to try to get there. I love the new movie, Inside Out 2. Inside Out 1 came out a few years ago, and it's an animated film about this little girl and her inner life, and so they make cartoon characters out of her emotions, joy and sorrow and all that. The first one is brilliant because it makes joy and sorrow best like necessary to each other. And I actually think it's a Pixar film or whatever, Disney, I don't even know, but it's like that's profoundly deep. The joy and sorrow are inseparable. Talk more about that another time. But then this Inside Out 2 inserts anxiety, and the kid later on is having the panic attack. And when we were watching this movie as a family this summer in the theater, everyone looks at me because I struggled for a period of time with panic attacks, and they knew it. And my wife looked at me. She put her hand on my back because I was crying because it's just girls going through it exactly how it is. And she's an ice hockey player. She gets put in a penalty box, and she starts breathing. She's breathing out of control, and she's slowing her breathing down. The sun hits her face. She puts her hand on the side of the box, and she's feeling it. She's breathing. She can smell the ice, and it doesn't say any of these things, but you see her grounding herself in her present place, and that's one helpful strategy for the ruminating anxiety monster that happens and takes us away, is to be grounded in the present in space. So your sight, your sound, your touch, your feel, and it was just beautiful how she breathed through it. This is all good fodder for me because I think that's I don't have a great working definition of spirituality outside of my own tradition, but it seems as though what's perennially true throughout all religious and spiritual traditions is this desire to be alive to the now, to be present. While thinking of the future and the past are important, to not live there, but to somehow be alive to the connected world that is now is very, very important to spiritual projects. So I haven't read the books, but I like those. And I think that what you're saying is right. That is something I probably haven't nailed hard enough in my little thought about this retrospective. You do it, and one of the benefits is to help you live more presently now. I think that's part of the resolution on that last step is it helps you live with the knowledge. Like in a Christian spiritual way, lives in the knowledge that you're not alone now. Like I am present to God and God is present to me now, and no matter what I face. And then, and if you want to be a secular person who practices spiritual practices, I mean, just even the fact that there is some abiding love or spirit or energy in your life now, like just knowing that something is there helping you to get through. I don't want to label that for anybody, but there is that thought that it can help you to be present to your now, or say, there's a reason why I should be aware and present right now. Look, 20 years tells me why I should be paying attention to the now.
Right.
Right.
The other thing that came up for me as you were talking is, and this is a question. I don't actually have any like grounded, hey, this is what I think about this. My question is, I wonder how much the space or the environment you're in has to do with you being able to tap into the kinds of things that you're talking about. Like you're talking about this experience you had in Scotland, doing it for you. I'm going to use the phrase sacred space right now to say, I wonder if there's some easier way to connect with oneself if they are in a place that allows them to. But I don't have any. I don't know what I really think of.
Yeah, I think so. So, I mean, I think there's probably several dimensions to it. Certainly psychologically, there are places that we're going to connect to in ways that are easier. And I think on a very, very simple level, being in a space that is outdoors, considered nature or wilderness, is very, very helpful, because being in boxes called rooms have this effect on us where it's almost like our thoughts can't get beyond where we're at. It facilitates a ruminating sort of practice more than being in a broad, wide open space. That's the forest bathing thing you hear about in the Japanese culture. But it's quite simply why people can go outside and kind of free their mind a little. That room it creates a sort of internal space. But there's also going to be places that we connect with nostalgically or because we've had good experiences, and that tees us up, puts us in a space, a mental space of experience that can be meaningful. So a lot of that is a church or a synagogue or some sort of sacred space. those places can also have psychological trauma attached to them too. Um, and so, you know, that's going to be on a case by case basis. I think that one of the things the concept of pilgrimage, to me is different than traveling in any other way we think of it. Because when we think of traveling or taking a tour or going on vacation, it's kind of flattened and linear. We go from point A to point B to maybe experience or see something, and then we come back.
Sure.
But the concept of pilgrimage is born out of an ancient and medieval worldview that doesn't just have a flattened kind of topography. It's intersected by a horizontal or by a vertical. Pardon me. It's connected to the transcendent. So each space that we step, each place we traverse, intersects with eternity or the infinite or the transcendent or divine. Everything is inspired by or given by that which is above. So places aren't just places. Places have names. It's not the back 40, right? Like in America, we have a very flattened sense of space. You don't name homes. You don't name fields, right? But in an older world, you name fields and forests and groves, and you name homes because they have something more gravitas to them, undergirded by a sense of the divine. So that each step is not just a step to go see something and to come back, but it's a step of transformation. It's a step of divine encounter. And that's what pilgrimages are supposed to elucidate. So I bring up pilgrimage as a practice that comes with this imagination of space, right? So I think that I always notice someone walks into the sanctuary of the church I serve, which is a very beautiful sanctuary, and some people are just stopped and awed, and they connect it. They get it. The beauty is there is supposed to lift the imagination to something beyond itself. It's beauty in and of itself. And then I've seen some people walk in and go, ooh, neat or nifty. And to them, they're just thinking of like, wow, you paid a lot of money for windows, right? Like they're not thinking of what is beyond the window. So your imagination can definitely affect the space, be affected by the space. And then it can also then transform a space that was once a nothing place can become something greater. I would like to see us all be in a spiritual place with practices where any place that we are can become holy, because I think it already is. But that requires more effort and discipline over time. So we are aided by sacred spaces that have been adorned with beauty or symbol or historic value to them, right?
Absolutely.
So it's very complicated. There's a lot more to say, but I think you're right. Yeah. So being in Scotland, being in St. Andrews in particular, I was teed up by the history, by the layers of time of sacred on top of sacred. But as I walked around, I also saw how that sacred had been sullied by evil and violence and reprehensible acts by Christians and non-Christians in the church and Protestants and Catholics and all that. And, it's all of it. And it all adds to the tapestry of this place. Any other thoughts or questions?
I think that we could talk about this topic for a very, very long time. I think there's a lot to say in the process of evaluating one's day, the process of evaluating one's unit of time or season of your life. And I certainly have a lot of questions for you personally that I think that we should probably talk about in a future episode related to your experience of the liver transplant. But I'm not sure that those are relevant to today.
A lot more to say. Let me say on kind of one of the angles of the show, which I appreciate that I don't pre-write it and produce it, that we try to let it be live and just see where it goes. But one of the angles I always want to focus on a little bit is how this is good beyond the personal individual.
Absolutely.
And I can tell you it's very simple. And maybe these all become just a few simple answers that keep coming back up. But I don't know people who have taken this sort of view of their life. I don't, when there are people who do that, and I know them, they tend to have a more reasonable stance about historic events, they tend to not be given to overblowing the news, right?
Sure.
They tend to be people who like, and I get it. It sells to say, if this happens, then it's the end of the world. It's the worst thing in the union, and so on and so forth. I saw a meme on social media yesterday with Elon Musk's face, and he said, it was a quote of his saying something like, in a bad business, business goes bad when bad people are put in charge. That's the same thing with this country, right? Like, it's just like a business for bad people put in charge. And so many people were liking it and sharing it. And I wrote, I'm like, it's just too bad that so many of his own employees don't want to work for him because he's terrible. Because I got family that work for his companies, and like everybody left at once because they overworked them, right? So, and I deleted. It's very specific kind of critique that I have, and I have a lot of questions about his morality and so on and so forth. But I mean, I was just, people just going kind of like, crazy about however they perceive the country today.
Sure.
And if you really look at it, it's an ebb and flow between two-party system in our country. Yep. The national debt has been grown by both. I mean, I can just go on and on. I mean, but it's really easy to kind of create the hysterical sort of, this is the thing that's going to ruin us, or this is the most terrible thing in the world, blah, 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 and just run after that. But the people who look back on their life like that tend to be people who also can look at the bigger picture of society and recognize it in the moment and not be given to panic or demonization or whatever the mob mentality is.
Sure.
So, but I think it's interesting that it starts with ourselves. I mean, it can really start with ourselves, seeing kind of the steadiness of time. And for those of us who believe in a God, we can see God's care and love throughout it. It gives us more sense of confidence and purpose, I think. So I think that's a way in which it's a tool.
Absolutely.
That serves a wider conversation. But for now, listen, let's talk more. I'd love to share more about my own experience with you on that, because I think that I'm still learning about it, and I don't know that I'll ever stop.
Yep.
And I do think there's things to say.
Awesome.
Nice chatting with you, my friend. Everybody else, God bless you. Don't forget to examine your day and examine your seasons. God bless.